15 years ago, Michael Turner disappeared after a heated argument with his wife, Emma Turner, on a deserted highway cutting through the Arizona wilderness. One moment he was there, shouting, fists clenched beneath the pale stars. The next, he was swallowed by darkness as if the desert had simply claimed him. His absence devastated the Turner family, leaving Emma isolated and their teenage daughter, Sarah, haunted by whispers and suspicions that would follow her through high school and into adulthood. The disappearance plunged the Turner household into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Sarah, just 16 at the time, watched her mother transform from a vibrant woman into a hollow shell who barely spoke and rarely left the house, except for work. The family's modest ranch-style home in Tucson became a monument to loss, with Michael's coffee mug still sitting on the kitchen counter, his work boots by the back door, and his reading glasses folded neatly on the nightstand. Emma couldn't bring herself to move these remnants of her husband's life, as if disturbing them might somehow make his disappearance more real, more permanent. Before continuing, subscribe and turn on notifications. Here we respectfully reopen cold cases and seek the truth. The local community was both shaken and perplexed by the sudden vanishing of a man they all knew. Michael worked as a maintenance supervisor at the local high school, a quiet but well-respected figure who fixed broken lockers and kept the football field in pristine condition. He coached Little League baseball on weekends and never missed Sunday service at St. Mary's Catholic Church. This wasn't the profile of someone who would simply walk away from his life, yet the alternative, that something terrible had happened, seemed equally impossible in their small, tight-knit community. The police offered various theories during those early weeks of investigation. Detective Ray Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the Pima County Sheriff's Department, initially suspected that Michael had chosen to disappear. "Sometimes men just walk away," he told reporters, citing financial pressures and marital problems as possible motivators. The couple's neighbors had reported hearing loud arguments coming from the Turner house in the weeks leading up to Michael's disappearance, fights that seemed to intensify whenever Michael came home late from his second job at a local auto parts store. But none of these explanations satisfied Michael's elderly mother, Dorothy Turner, a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher who lived just 3 blocks away from her son's family. Dorothy knew her boy better than anyone, she insisted, and Michael would never abandon Sarah, especially not during her junior year of high school when she was applying to colleges and preparing for her SATs. "My son was many things," Dorothy told anyone who would listen, "but he was not a coward and he was not cruel." As weeks turned into months, the investigation grew cold. Detective Morrison followed every lead, interviewed every person who had seen Michael in his final days, and combed through the family's financial records, looking for signs of planning or desperation. They found neither. Michael's bank account contained exactly $347 at the time of his disappearance, and his last withdrawal had been $20 from an ATM near his workplace, hardly the preparation of a man planning to start a new life elsewhere. The community's initial support gradually faded as the mystery deepened. Neighbors who had once brought casseroles and offered to help with yard work began to whisper about Emma's strange behavior in the aftermath of her husband's disappearance. She had become increasingly reclusive, declining invitations to church functions and neighborhood gatherings. Some people noticed that she seemed almost relieved at times, laughing too loudly at inappropriate moments, or appearing surprisingly composed when discussing her missing husband. Sarah bore the brunt of the community's suspicion and curiosity. Classmates would fall silent when she entered a room, and she could feel their eyes following her through the hallways at school. Teachers treated her with an uncomfortable mixture of pity and concern that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. She began eating lunch alone in the library, losing herself in mystery novels that offered the kind of resolution that her real life seemed to lack. For years, the story of the Turners drifted through town like desert wind, sorrow-shadowed, unresolved, and replayed by those who could never quite give it up. Every anniversary of Michael's disappearance brought renewed attention, with local news stations running brief updates that contained no new information. The case file grew thin, reduced to a few witness statements, some photographs of Michael's abandoned personal effects, and a timeline that led nowhere. As time stretched on, Michael Turner became just another face on a faded missing person flyer tacked to the bulletin board at the local grocery store, his smile growing more distant with each passing season. The initial urgency that had driven the investigation slowly gave way to bureaucratic routine and eventually to a resignation that settled over the case like dust on a forgotten shelf. Friends and neighbors moved on with their lives, resigned to not knowing the truth, but Emma Turner lived in a state of suspended animation, trapped between the role of grieving widow and something more complicated, more troubling. The weight of Michael's absence pressed down on the Turner household like a physical force. Emma found herself talking to empty rooms, setting 2 plates for dinner out of habit, and waking up in the middle of the night, reaching for a warm body that was no longer there. Yet alongside the grief, there was something else, a nervous energy that manifested in obsessive cleaning, rearranging furniture, and long drives through the desert that she could never quite explain to the few friends who still called to check on her. Sarah watched her mother navigate this strange new existence with growing unease. The woman who had once been the center of their family's emotional life now seemed to exist on the periphery of her own experience, going through the motions of living without any apparent purpose or joy. Emma continued working her job as a receptionist at a dental office, arriving precisely on time each morning and leaving exactly at 5:30 each evening. Her co-workers described her as reliable but distant, someone who did her job competently, but never engaged in the casual conversations that make a workplace feel human. The community's response to the family's tragedy evolved from sympathy to something more complex and uncomfortable. While most people genuinely wanted to help, they found themselves uncertain about how to interact with a family whose loss had no clear resolution. How do you comfort someone whose husband might be dead, or might have chosen to abandon them? The ambiguity made people uncomfortable, and gradually, invitations stopped coming. Phone calls became less frequent, and the Turners found themselves increasingly isolated. Detective Morrison continued to work the case sporadically, following up on occasional tips that led nowhere and revisiting old evidence with fresh eyes whenever his workload permitted. He had seen enough missing person cases to know that most people don't simply vanish without a trace, but he had also learned that sometimes the truth is darker and more complicated than anyone wants to acknowledge. There was something about Emma Turner's behavior that bothered him, not anything he could articulate in a report or use to justify expanded investigation, but a gut feeling that important pieces of the puzzle were being deliberately concealed. The detective's concerns were based on subtle inconsistencies that had emerged during the initial investigation. Emma's account of the argument that preceded Michael's disappearance had changed slightly each time she told it, with details shifting in ways that seemed significant but were difficult to pin down. She claimed they had fought about money, then about his drinking, then about his long hours at work. Each version contained elements of truth. The family did have financial stress. Michael did drink more than he used to, and he had been working extra shifts to make ends meet. But the shifting narrative suggested something more complex was being concealed. Sarah struggled through her remaining years of high school, carrying the weight of her father's disappearance and her mother's increasingly erratic behavior. She excelled academically, throwing herself into her studies with an intensity that worried her teachers, and earned her admission to Arizona State University on a partial scholarship. But even her achievements felt hollow, colored by the absence of the parent who should have been there to celebrate them. Michael had always been the one who helped with homework, who attended parent-teacher conferences, who made sure she felt supported and loved. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone in Sarah's young adult life became a reminder of what was missing. The family traditions that had once defined their lives, Michael's elaborate Halloween decorations, his insistence on cutting down their own Christmas tree, his pride in grilling the perfect 4th of July barbecue, slowly faded away. Emma seemed incapable of maintaining these connections to their former happiness, and Sarah lacked the emotional energy to sustain them on her own. Dorothy Turner, Michael's mother, became increasingly frail as the years passed, her health declining in direct proportion to her diminishing hope of seeing her son again. She continued to call the police department monthly, asking for updates that never came, and she maintained a scrapbook of newspaper clippings and missing person flyers that documented her son's case with obsessive detail. Friends from her church tried to encourage her to focus on healing and acceptance, but Dorothy couldn't let go of the belief that Michael was out there somewhere, waiting to be found. The desert itself seemed to mock the family's suffering, its vast emptiness offering infinite possibilities for concealment while revealing nothing. Search parties had combed through miles of wilderness in the weeks following Michael's disappearance, but the landscape was too big, too unforgiving, and too good at keeping secrets. As the years passed, even the most dedicated volunteers began to accept that, if Michael Turner was somewhere in that endless expanse of sand and rock, he might never be found. As the 2000s unfolded, Detective Ray Morrison approached retirement with a handful of unresolved cases that would haunt him long after he turned in his badge. The Michael Turner disappearance was chief among them, a puzzle with too many missing pieces and too many questions that had never been adequately answered. When Detective Lisa Chen joined the Pima County Sheriff's Department in 2008, fresh from a master's degree in criminology and eager to prove herself, Morrison took her under his wing and shared his concerns about cases that had gone cold due to insufficient resources or investigative blind spots. Chen brought a new perspective to the Turner file, approaching it without the preconceptions and personal relationships that had complicated the original investigation. She spent weeks reviewing every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every photograph taken at the scene where Michael was last seen. What she discovered was a case file that looked thorough on the surface, but contained significant gaps and inconsistencies that had been overlooked or dismissed during the initial investigation. The first red flag was the timeline of events on the night Michael disappeared. According to Ima's statement, she and Michael had driven out to a secluded area near Saguanita Creek to discuss their marital problems away from Sarah's hearing. This location was roughly 30 miles from their home, a drive that would have taken them through several small communities and past numerous businesses with security cameras, yet there was no record of their vehicle being spotted by any witnesses during either the journey out or Ima's alleged return trip alone. Chen decided to re-interview some of the witnesses from the original investigation, starting with the neighbors who had reported hearing arguments from the Turner household in the weeks preceding Michael's disappearance. What she discovered was troubling. Several neighbors mentioned details that hadn't been included in the original police reports, specifically that they had seen Emma leaving the house alone late at night on multiple occasions during the weeks before Michael vanished, and that these departures seemed to coincide with periods when Michael's car was not in the driveway. The detective also noticed inconsistencies in Ima's description of her husband's mental state in the days before his disappearance. In her initial statement, she had described Michael as depressed and increasingly unstable, suggesting that he might have been contemplating suicide or abandoning his family. But interviews with his co-workers painted a different picture. They described a man who seemed tired and stressed, but was making plans for the future. He had recently signed up for a summer maintenance training program and had been discussing vacation plans with his supervisor. Chen's most significant discovery came when she decided to re-examine the family's financial records, something the original investigation had done only superficially. What she found was a pattern of unusual activity in the months leading up to Michael's disappearance. Ima had taken out a small personal loan 2 months before her husband vanished, claiming she needed money for home repairs. Yet there was no evidence that any repairs had been completed, and the loan money had been withdrawn in cash in several small amounts over the course of 6 weeks. Even more suspicious was the discovery that Emma had called a local auto salvage yard just 3 days after Michael's disappearance, asking about the process for disposing of a vehicle and what documentation would be required. When Chen contacted the salvage yard owner, he clearly remembered the call because it had struck him as odd. Most people who wanted to get rid of a car came in person with the vehicle rather than calling to ask about hypothetical procedures. Now, I invite you to comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We want to know how far and at what moments these documented stories reach. The community's perception of the case began to shift as word of Chen's investigation leaked out through the informal networks that connect small towns. People who had previously viewed Ima as a tragic figure began to look at her with suspicion and uncertainty. The grocery store clerk, who had always made sympathetic small talk, began to watch Ima more carefully during her weekly shopping trips. The mail carrier noticed that she had started intercepting her mail at the end of the driveway, rather than allowing him to approach the house. These small changes in behavior suggested a woman who was increasingly aware of being watched and judged. Sarah, now a college junior studying psychology at Arizona State University, began to notice these subtle shifts in her hometown's attitude toward her family. During visits home, she sensed that conversations stopped when she entered rooms, and old family friends seemed uncomfortable making eye contact. The weight of unspoken suspicions began to affect her academic performance and her relationships with her peers. She found herself questioning memories of her parents' marriage, wondering if the loving family dynamic she remembered had been an illusion or if something darker had been happening beneath the surface. Dorothy Turner's declining health took a sharp turn for the worse as rumors about the renewed investigation reached her. The elderly woman had spent more than a decade clinging to the hope that her son would return home, and the suggestion that he might have been the victim of violence, possibly at the hands of his own wife, was almost too devastating to process. Her friends from church rallied around her, providing emotional support and practical assistance, but nothing could ease the anguish of wondering if she had been naive about the true nature of her son's marriage. The case that had once seemed straightforward, a man disappears after an argument, probably by choice, was becoming something much more complex and sinister. Chen's investigation was methodical and thorough, but it was also stirring up emotions and suspicions that had been dormant for years. The detective knew she was walking a fine line between seeking justice and destroying whatever remained of the Turner family's ability to function, but she also knew that Michael Turner deserved to have his story told truthfully, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might be. In the summer of 2010, 15 years after Michael Turner's disappearance, a group of geology students from the University of Arizona were conducting a field study in the remote wilderness area east of Tucson when they stumbled upon what would become the breakthrough that law enforcement had been waiting for. The students were mapping mineral deposits and documenting erosion patterns when one of them noticed something metallic glinting beneath a cluster of Palo Verde trees and mesquite bushes. What they had found was the rusted shell of a sedan, almost completely hidden by desert vegetation that had grown up around it over the course of many seasons. The vehicle was located approximately 47 miles from the Turner family home, in an area so remote that it was accessible only by dirt roads that were barely visible on most maps. The car had settled into a natural depression in the landscape, and years of flash floods had deposited sand and debris around it, creating a natural camouflage that had kept it hidden from the occasional hunters and off-road enthusiasts who ventured into the area. Only the persistence of the geology students, who were trained to notice anomalies in the natural environment, had led to its discovery. Dr. Patricia Williams, the professor supervising the field study, immediately recognized the significance of the find and contacted the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Within hours, Detective Lisa Chen was standing in the desert heat, staring at what she strongly suspected was Michael Turner's missing vehicle. The license plate, though badly corroded, was still readable, and a quick check confirmed her suspicions. This was the 1993 Honda Accord that had been the subject of a statewide BOLO alert 15 years earlier. The location of the vehicle raised immediate questions about the timeline and circumstances of Michael's disappearance. The remote spot where the car was found was not accessible from the area near Saguanita Creek, where Emma claimed their argument had taken place. Someone would have had to deliberately drive the vehicle to this isolated location, navigating rough terrain and dirt roads that required local knowledge and careful planning. This was not the kind of place someone would end up by accident or in the heat of an emotional moment. Chen coordinated with the county coroner's office and the state crime scene investigation unit to ensure that the vehicle was processed properly. The car had to be carefully excavated from the sand and debris that had accumulated around it, a process that took the better part of 2 days. Every piece of vegetation, every rock, every fragment of glass or metal was catalogued and preserved as potential evidence. The investigators knew they might only get one chance to examine the vehicle thoroughly, and they couldn't afford to overlook anything that might provide answers to questions that had lingered for more than a decade. The car's exterior told a story of long exposure to the desert environment. The paint had faded to an indeterminate color, the rubber seals around the windows had cracked and deteriorated, and small animals had clearly made homes in the engine compartment. But despite the ravages of time and weather, the vehicle's basic structure remained intact. The doors could still be opened, though they protested with squeaks and groans that echoed across the empty landscape. As the investigation team prepared to examine the car's interior, Chen felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that accompanied major developments in cold cases. After 15 years of questions and speculation, they were finally in a position to learn what had really happened to Michael Turner. The answers might bring closure to a family that had been living in limbo, but they might also reveal truths that would be difficult for everyone involved to accept. The car's interior had been remarkably well preserved, protected from the worst effects of the weather by intact windows and door seals. The seats were faded and cracked, and there was evidence of small animals having nested in the upholstery. But the basic configuration of the vehicle remained clearly visible. Personal items were scattered throughout the passenger compartment: a coffee mug with the logo of Michael's employer, a pair of work gloves in the glove compartment, a small toolbox behind the driver's seat. What immediately caught Chen's attention was the absence of any signs of a struggle inside the passenger compartment. The seats were still properly positioned, the mirrors were correctly adjusted, and there was no evidence of damage or disturbance that would suggest violence had occurred inside the vehicle. This observation was significant because it contradicted some of the theories that had been developed during the original investigation. If Michael had been the victim of random violence or carjacking, there should have been signs of a struggle. The investigators paid particular attention to the area around the driver's seat, looking for any evidence that might indicate who had been driving the car when it was abandoned in this remote location. They found several items that clearly belonged to Michael: his sunglasses in the console, a work schedule tucked into the sun visor, a few loose coins in the cup holder. But they also found something that seemed out of place: a woman's hair tie wrapped around the gear shift lever, and a small bottle of nail polish in a shade that seemed too bright for someone of Michael's conservative tastes. The trunk of the vehicle remained locked, and the investigators decided to wait until they could transport the car to a controlled environment before attempting to open it. The trunk lock mechanism was badly corroded, and there was a risk of damaging potential evidence if they tried to force it open in the field. Chen made the decision to have the entire vehicle transported to the county crime lab, where it could be examined under optimal conditions by forensic specialists. As the car was loaded onto a flatbed truck for transport, Chen couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of a major breakthrough in the case. The location where the vehicle had been found, the condition of the interior, and the presence of items that seemed to belong to both Michael and Ima suggested a scenario that was far more complex than a simple disappearance. The detective knew that whatever they found in the trunk of that car would likely change the direction of the investigation permanently. The drive back to town seemed to take forever, with Chen following the transport truck and thinking about all the ways this discovery might affect the Turner family. Sarah was now a college graduate working as a counselor at a youth center, trying to build a life for herself despite the shadow of her father's disappearance. Ima was still living in the family home, still working at the dental office, still maintaining the fiction that she was simply a widow waiting for answers. And Dorothy Turner, now 88 years old and in declining health, was still clinging to the hope that her son would somehow come home. The Pima County Crime Laboratory was a modern facility designed to handle the most sensitive and complex forensic investigations, but even the experienced technicians who worked there felt a sense of anticipation as they prepared to examine Michael Turner's vehicle. The car had been transported under optimal conditions, and every precaution had been taken to preserve any evidence that might have survived 15 years in the desert. Detective Chen stood beside the vehicle in the sterile white environment of the lab, knowing that the next few hours would likely provide answers to questions that had haunted a family and a community for more than a decade. The forensic team began with a comprehensive photographic documentation of the vehicle's exterior and interior, capturing every detail that might prove significant later in the investigation. They used specialized lighting and high-resolution cameras to document scratches, dents, and wear patterns that could provide clues about how the car had been used in its final days. The team leader, Dr. Sandra Martinez, was a veteran forensic investigator who had worked on some of the most challenging cases in Arizona's history, and she approached the Turner vehicle with the methodical care that had made her reputation. The process of opening the trunk required delicate work with specialized tools, designed to preserve evidence while overcoming the effects of corrosion and time. The lock mechanism had been damaged by years of exposure to extreme temperature variations and mineral deposits from flash floods, but the technicians were eventually able to manipulate it without causing additional damage to the surrounding metal. As the trunk lid was slowly raised, revealing its contents for the first time in 15 years, everyone in the lab held their breath. The trunk contained a large canvas duffel bag that appeared to have been deliberately placed there rather than thrown in hastily. Beside the bag were several other items that clearly belonged to Michael Turner: a worn leather jacket that his family would later identify as his favorite, a pair of work boots that showed the distinctive wear patterns of someone who spent long hours on his feet, and a baseball cap with the logo of the local Little League team he had coached. These personal items had been arranged almost carefully, as if someone had wanted to preserve them or ensure they would be found together. Dr. Martinez and her team approached the duffel bag with extreme caution, knowing that whatever it contained would likely be the key to understanding what had happened to Michael Turner. The bag's zipper was corroded but functional, and as it was slowly opened under the bright lights of the laboratory, the contents became visible piece by piece. What they found confirmed the investigators' worst fears, while simultaneously answering questions that had plagued the case for 15 years. Inside the bag were the unmistakable remains of a human skeleton, still partially clothed in the deteriorated remnants of what had once been a work shirt and jeans. The bones had been carefully arranged, suggesting that whoever had placed them in the bag had taken time to ensure they were positioned properly rather than simply dumped inside. Dental records would later confirm what everyone in the room already suspected. These were the remains of Michael Turner, finally found after 15 years of searching and speculation. The condition of the remains told a story that forensic experts could read like a book. The bones showed no signs of trauma that would suggest violence, no fractures, no cut marks, no evidence of blunt force impact. This absence of obvious injury was significant because it ruled out many of the theories that had been developed during the original investigation. Michael had not been beaten, shot, or stabbed. Whatever had caused his death had left no mark on his skeletal remains. Dr. Martinez's team found several items of particular interest among the remains. A wedding ring was still on the appropriate finger, engraved with the date of Michael and Emma's marriage, and still bearing traces of the inscription that had been worn smooth by years of daily wear. A watch that family members would later identify as Michael's favorite was found near the wrist bones, its face cracked but still readable. Most significantly, they discovered a small plastic bottle that had once contained prescription medication, though the label had deteriorated beyond readability. The forensic examination revealed other details that would prove crucial to understanding the timeline of events. The clothing found with the remains was consistent with what Michael had been wearing on the day of his disappearance, based on descriptions provided by his family and co-workers. The deterioration patterns suggested that the remains had been placed in the trunk shortly after death, rather than being moved there after an extended period of exposure to the elements. As news of the discovery spread through the law enforcement community, Detective Chen found herself coordinating with multiple agencies and specialists. The medical examiner would need to conduct a thorough analysis of the remains to determine the cause of death. Toxicology tests would be performed on any tissue samples that had been preserved, though the likelihood of finding usable material after 15 years was slim. DNA testing would provide definitive identification, even though the dental records had already confirmed the victim's identity. The discovery of Michael's remains in the trunk of his own car fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. This was no longer a missing person case with multiple possible explanations. This was now a homicide investigation, and the evidence suggested that whoever had killed Michael Turner had gone to considerable lengths to conceal the crime. The remote location where the car had been abandoned, the careful arrangement of the remains, and the presence of Michael's personal effects all pointed to a perpetrator who had planned carefully and acted deliberately. Chen knew that the focus of the investigation would now shift to the people who had been closest to Michael in his final days. Emma Turner, who had been living under a cloud of suspicion for 15 years, would now face the full scrutiny of a homicide investigation. The detective also knew that the discovery would devastate Michael's family, who had clung to the hope that he might still be alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia or living under an assumed identity. The process of notifying the family about the discovery was one of the most difficult aspects of Chen's job. She had dealt with death notifications many times during her career, but there was something particularly tragic about informing people that their loved one had been dead for 15 years while they continued to hope for his return. Sarah Turner was now 28 years old, a successful professional who had built a life for herself despite the shadow of her father's disappearance. Dorothy Turner was 88 and in failing health, and Chen worried that the news might be too much for the elderly woman to bear. The community's reaction to the discovery was complex and multifaceted. Many people felt vindicated in their long-held suspicions that something terrible had happened to Michael Turner. Others were shocked by the confirmation that a murder had occurred in their quiet community, and that the perpetrator had apparently been living among them for 15 years. The case that had been a source of speculation and gossip for more than a decade was now a confirmed tragedy that would require the community to confront some uncomfortable truths about the people they thought they knew. The confirmation that Michael Turner had been murdered transformed the investigation from a cold case review into an active homicide inquiry, bringing with it a level of scrutiny and resources that had been absent for 15 years. Detective Chen found herself working closely with the district attorney's office, forensic specialists from across the state, and behavioral analysts who could help interpret the evidence that had been recovered from the desert. Every aspect of the case was re-examined with fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques that had not been available during the original investigation. The forensic analysis of Michael's remains provided crucial information about the circumstances of his death, even though the passage of 15 years had eliminated some potential evidence. The absence of trauma to the skeletal remains ruled out many forms of violence, but toxicology tests on preserved tissue samples revealed the presence of a powerful sedative that had not been prescribed to Michael. The drug, commonly used to treat severe anxiety and insomnia, could be lethal in large doses, especially when combined with alcohol. This discovery provided the first clear indication of how Michael had died, and it suggested a level of premeditation that made the crime even more disturbing. Chen's team discovered that the sedative found in Michael's system had been prescribed to Emma Turner just 6 weeks before her husband's disappearance. The prescription had been filled at a pharmacy across town from where the family usually obtained their medications, and Emma had paid cash rather than using her insurance. When investigators contacted the prescribing physician, they learned that Emma had complained of severe anxiety and insomnia related to marital stress, and that she had specifically requested a medication that would help her sleep through the night without waking up. The financial investigation that Chen had begun earlier now took on new significance in light of the homicide confirmation. The personal loan that Emma had obtained 2 months before Michael's death was used to purchase a number of items that seemed suspicious in retrospect: a set of heavy-duty plastic tarps, several bags of lime, a small shovel, and a pair of heavy work gloves. These purchases had been made at different stores across Tucson, always with cash, and always during times when Emma should have been at work. The pattern suggested careful planning and an awareness of the need to avoid creating a paper trail. Chen also discovered that Emma had been having an affair with a co-worker at the dental office where she worked. The relationship had been going on for several months before Michael's disappearance, and text messages recovered from old phone company records revealed that Emma and her lover had discussed the possibility of being together permanently, while the co-worker had a solid alibi for the night of Michael's disappearance and showed no signs of direct involvement in the murder. The affair provided a clear motive for Emma to want her husband out of the picture. The investigation into the night of Michael's disappearance revealed a timeline that was far different from what Emma had initially reported. Security camera footage from a gas station near the Turner home showed Emma's car leaving the area at approximately 11:30 p.m. on the night Michael vanished, but the car was seen returning nearly 4 hours later, much longer than would have been required for a trip to the argument location that Emma had described. Cell phone tower data confirmed that Emma's phone had been in the vicinity of the remote area where Michael's car was eventually found, despite her claims that she had never been to that location. If this case has already gripped you, hit like. It helps Michael Turner's story reach more people. The psychological profile that behavioral analysts developed of the perpetrator was consistent with Emma's personality and circumstances. The crime showed careful planning, emotional detachment, and a willingness to manipulate others' perceptions over an extended period. The fact that Emma had lived with the secret of her husband's murder for 15 years, maintaining relationships with his family, and participating in searches for his body, suggested a level of psychological compartmentalization that was both impressive and deeply disturbing. Interviews with friends and family members revealed a pattern of behavior that had seemed innocuous at the time, but now appeared suspicious in light of the evidence. Several people mentioned that Emma had seemed unusually calm in the days immediately following Michael's disappearance, more concerned with practical matters like cancelling his credit cards and contacting his employer than with the emotional trauma of losing her husband. Others noted that she had discouraged extensive search efforts, suggesting that Michael had probably chosen to leave and would contact them when he was ready. The investigation also revealed that Emma had attempted to collect on Michael's life insurance policy just 6 months after his disappearance, despite the standard requirement that missing persons be presumed dead only after 7 years. When the insurance company denied her claim, she had consulted with several attorneys about the possibility of having Michael declared legally dead, though she ultimately decided not to pursue this course of action. These attempts to benefit financially from her husband's disappearance provided additional evidence of premeditation and motive. Sarah Turner's world was shattered by the revelations about her mother's involvement in her father's death. The young woman who had spent 15 years grieving for her missing father now had to confront the possibility that the person who had comforted her through that grief was actually responsible for causing it. Sarah cooperated fully with the investigation, providing investigators with information about her parents' marriage and her mother's behavior in the years following the disappearance. The emotional toll of this betrayal was evident in every conversation Sarah had with law enforcement. Dorothy Turner's reaction to the news was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire investigation. The elderly woman had spent 15 years defending her daughter-in-law against community suspicions, insisting that Emma was as much a victim as anyone else. Learning that Emma was actually responsible for Michael's death was devastating for Dorothy, who had trusted and supported the woman who had killed her son. The stress of this revelation contributed to a rapid decline in Dorothy's already fragile health. The community's response to the emerging evidence was complex and divided. Some people felt vindicated in their long-held suspicions about Emma's involvement in Michael's disappearance. Others were shocked by the revelation that someone they had known for years was capable of such calculated violence. The case forced the community to confront uncomfortable questions about how well they really knew their neighbors and what signs they might have missed during the 15 years that Emma had been living among them as a murderer. As the evidence mounted against Emma Turner, Chen and the district attorney's office began preparing for what they knew would be a challenging prosecution. The physical evidence was compelling, but the passage of 15 years had eliminated many potential witnesses and made some aspects of the case difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution would need to construct a narrative that explained not only how Michael had died, but why Emma had chosen to kill him and how she had managed to conceal the crime for so long. The arrest warrant for Emma Turner was signed on a cold morning in November 2010, exactly 15 years and 3 months after Michael's disappearance. Chen and her team had spent months building their case, and they were confident that they had enough evidence to secure a conviction. But they also knew that the arrest would mark the beginning of a legal process that would be emotionally devastating for everyone involved, particularly for Sarah and Dorothy Turner, who would have to testify about the woman who had destroyed their family while pretending to be a victim herself. The arrest of Emma Turner sent shockwaves through the quiet Tucson community that had harbored suspicions about Michael's disappearance for 15 long years. On that November morning in 2010, Detective Chen and her team arrived at the dental office, where Emma had worked for nearly 2 decades, knowing that this moment would finally bring some measure of justice for Michael Turner, but also understanding that it would devastate the lives of innocent family members who had already suffered immeasurably. Emma's reaction to her arrest was unnervingly calm, almost as if she had been expecting this moment for years. She offered no resistance as the handcuffs were placed on her wrists, and her only request was to call her daughter before being transported to the county jail. The co-workers who witnessed the arrest described a woman who seemed relieved rather than shocked, as if the weight of carrying her secret for 15 years had finally become unbearable. Sarah Turner was working at the Youth Counseling Center, where she had built her career when she received the phone call that would change her life forever. The news that her mother had been arrested for her father's murder was so incomprehensible that she initially thought there had been some terrible mistake. The young woman who had spent half her life grieving for her missing father now had to confront the devastating reality that the person who had comforted her through that grief was actually responsible for causing it. The psychological impact on Sarah was immediate and profound. Everything she thought she knew about her family, her childhood, and her mother's character had been built on a foundation of lies. She began questioning every memory, every conversation, every moment of tenderness that she had shared with her mother over the years. Had Emma's comfort during Sarah's darkest moments been genuine, or simply part of an elaborate performance designed to maintain her cover? The uncertainty was almost as painful as the loss of her father had been. Dorothy Turner's response to her daughter-in-law's arrest was perhaps even more heartbreaking. The 88-year-old woman had spent 15 years defending Emma against community whispers and suspicions, insisting that anyone who suggested Emma's involvement in Michael's disappearance was being cruel and unfair. Learning that her instincts had been so completely wrong and that she had been protecting the person who had killed her son was a betrayal that cut deeper than anything she had experienced in her long life. The revelation forced Dorothy to re-examine every interaction she had had with Emma since Michael's disappearance. She remembered how Emma had been the one to suggest that search efforts were pointless, how she had discouraged Dorothy from hiring a private investigator, how she had seemed oddly detached during the most emotional moments of the family's grieving process. Details that had seemed innocuous at the time now appeared sinister when viewed through the lens of Emma's guilt. The community's reaction was complex and multifaceted, reflecting the various relationships that different people had maintained with the Turner family over the years. Some residents felt vindicated in their long-held suspicions, while others were shocked by the confirmation that their quiet neighborhood had harbored a murderer for more than a decade. The case forced everyone to confront uncomfortable questions about how well they really knew their neighbors and what signs they might have overlooked. Local media coverage of the arrest was extensive, with reporters camping outside the Turner family home and attempting to interview anyone who had known the family. The story of a woman who had killed her husband and then lived with the secret for 15 years while maintaining the facade of a grieving widow was the kind of case that captured public attention and generated intense speculation about motive and method. The legal proceedings that followed were emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Sarah found herself in the impossible position of being a key witness in the prosecution of her own mother, forced to testify about family dynamics and her mother's behavior in the years following her father's disappearance. The young woman's testimony was crucial to establishing the timeline of events and demonstrating the calculated nature of Emma's deception, but it came at an enormous personal cost. During the trial preparation, prosecutors revealed the full scope of Emma's planning and deception. The evidence showed that she had been contemplating Michael's murder for months before actually carrying it out, carefully acquiring the materials she would need and establishing alibis for her actions. The premeditated nature of the crime made it even more disturbing, as it demonstrated that Emma had not acted in a moment of passion, but had coldly calculated the best way to eliminate her husband and escape detection. The affair that had provided Emma with a motive for murder became a central focus of the prosecution's case. Text messages and phone records revealed that Emma and her lover had discussed their future together, but that Michael's presence was seen as an obstacle to their happiness. While the lover was not charged as an accomplice, his testimony about their relationship and Emma's state of mind provided crucial insight into her motivations. The defense team faced an almost impossible task in trying to create reasonable doubt about Emma's guilt. The physical evidence was overwhelming, the timeline was clear, and the motive was well established. Their strategy focused on challenging the forensic evidence and suggesting that other explanations were possible, but they were fighting an uphill battle against a case that prosecutors had built methodically over months of investigation. One of the most poignant aspects of the trial was the testimony from Michael's former co-workers and friends, who described a man who had been looking forward to his future and making plans for his family. These witnesses painted a picture of someone who was dealing with normal life stresses, but who had no intention of abandoning his responsibilities or disappearing from his daughter's life. Their testimony effectively countered any suggestion that Michael had chosen to leave voluntarily. The trial also revealed the psychological toll that keeping such a massive secret had taken on Emma over the years. Mental health experts testified about the kind of compartmentalization required to maintain a normal life while hiding such a significant crime. Some suggested that Emma's increasingly erratic behavior in recent years might have been the result of the stress of maintaining her deception, while others argued that her ability to function normally for 15 years demonstrated a level of psychological detachment that was deeply concerning. Sarah's victim impact statement, delivered near the end of the trial, was one of the most emotionally powerful moments in the proceedings. She spoke about the double loss she had experienced, first losing her father to what she thought was a mysterious disappearance, and then losing her mother to the revelation of her guilt. She described the difficulty of rebuilding her understanding of her own life and family history, and the challenge of moving forward when everything she had believed about her past had been revealed to be a lie. The symbolism of absence that had defined the Turner family's experience for 15 years took on new meaning as the truth emerged. Michael's absence had not been a mystery to be solved, but a crime to be concealed. The empty chair at the dinner table, the unworn clothes in the closet, the unmade plans for the future, all of these had been the result of a deliberate act of violence rather than an unexplained tragedy. This realization added another layer of grief for family members who now had to mourn not only their loss but also the deception that had surrounded it. The trial of Emma Turner began in the spring of 2011, nearly 16 years after Michael's disappearance and 6 months after his remains were discovered in the desert. The Pima County Courthouse was packed with spectators, including members of the Turner family, community residents who had followed the case for years, and media representatives from across Arizona. The case had captured public attention not only because of its dramatic elements, but also because it represented a kind of justice that many people believed would never come. Prosecutor David Rodriguez opened the state's case with a methodical presentation of evidence that painted a picture of careful premeditation and calculated deception. He described how Emma Turner had planned her husband's murder for months, acquiring the materials she would need, establishing false alibis, and manipulating the investigation to avoid detection. The prosecutor's opening statement was deliberately understated, allowing the evidence to speak for itself rather than relying on dramatic rhetoric. The forensic evidence presented during the trial was compelling and comprehensive. Dr. Sandra Martinez testified about the examination of Michael's remains and the discovery of the sedative that had caused his death. Her testimony was technical but accessible, explaining how the forensic team had been able to determine cause of death despite the passage of 15 years. The presence of Emma's prescription medication in Michael's system was particularly damning, as it provided a direct link between the defendant and the victim's death. Detective Chen's testimony covered the investigative process that had led to Emma's arrest, including the discovery of financial records, cell phone data, and security camera footage that contradicted Emma's version of events. The detective's presentation was thorough and professional, demonstrating how modern investigative techniques had been able to solve a case that had seemed hopeless using the methods available in 1995. Perhaps the most emotionally difficult testimony came from Sarah Turner, who was called as a prosecution witness to describe her mother's behavior in the years following her father's disappearance. Sarah's testimony was crucial to establishing the timeline of events and demonstrating how Emma had maintained her deception over many years. The young woman struggled to maintain her composure as she described conversations with her mother about her father's disappearance, knowing now that every word of comfort had been a lie. The defense team, led by experienced criminal attorney Janet Morrison, faced an almost impossible challenge in creating reasonable doubt about Emma's guilt. Their strategy focused on challenging the forensic evidence and suggesting that the investigation had been influenced by confirmation bias, that investigators had decided Emma was guilty and had interpreted evidence to support that conclusion. Morrison argued that the prosecution's case was based on circumstantial evidence and speculation rather than definitive proof. The defense also attempted to portray Emma as a victim of domestic abuse who had acted in self-defense, though this strategy was undermined by the premeditated nature of the crime and the lack of any evidence of physical violence in the Turner marriage. Character witnesses testified about Emma's reputation in the community and her role as a devoted mother, but their testimony seemed inadequate against the weight of physical evidence and the methodical nature of the crime. One of the most controversial aspects of the trial was the question of whether Emma would testify on her own behalf. Her attorneys ultimately decided against having her take the stand, recognizing that cross-examination would likely be devastating given the extent of her deception over the years. This decision was probably wise from a legal standpoint, but it left many questions unanswered about Emma's motivations and state of mind. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from Emma's former lover, who described their affair and the conversations they had had about their future together. While he maintained that he had never suggested that Emma should harm her husband, his testimony established that Emma had seen Michael as an obstacle to her happiness and had been looking for a way to remove him from her life permanently. Medical experts testified about the effects of the sedative found in Michael's system, explaining how the drug could have been administered without the victim's knowledge and how it would have caused death when given in large doses. This testimony was crucial to establishing that Michael's death had been caused by deliberate poisoning rather than accidental overdose or suicide. The trial also included testimony from community members who had participated in search efforts for Michael in the weeks following his disappearance. Their descriptions of Emma's behavior during these searches, her apparent lack of urgency, her suggestions that the efforts were pointless, her attempts to discourage extensive searching, took on new significance when viewed through the lens of her guilt. Dorothy Turner's testimony was one of the most heartbreaking moments of the trial. The elderly woman, now 89 and in failing health, described her relationship with her daughter-in-law and her efforts to support Emma through what she had believed was a shared tragedy. Her realization that she had been protecting the person who had killed her son was devastating to witness, and her testimony provided powerful evidence of the broader impact of Emma's crime. The closing arguments in the case reflected the stark contrast between the prosecution's methodical case and the defense's desperate attempts to create doubt. Prosecutor Rodriguez summarized the evidence systematically, demonstrating how each piece of the puzzle fit together to create an overwhelming case for Emma's guilt. Defense attorney Morrison made an impassioned plea for the jury to consider the possibility that the investigation had been flawed and that reasonable doubt existed about her client's guilt. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on charges of first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. The speed of their deliberation reflected the strength of the prosecution's case and the comprehensive nature of the evidence that had been presented. Emma showed no visible emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same calm demeanor that had characterized her behavior throughout the trial. The sentencing phase of the trial provided an opportunity for family members to describe the impact of Emma's crime on their lives. Sarah delivered a powerful victim impact statement in which she described the double trauma of losing her father and then discovering her mother's guilt. Dorothy Turner, despite her advanced age and declining health, insisted on speaking about the loss of her son and the betrayal she felt at having been deceived for so many years. Judge Patricia Hendricks sentenced Emma Turner to life in prison without the possibility of parole, citing the premeditated nature of the crime and the defendant's 15-year effort to conceal her guilt. The judge noted that Emma had not only killed her husband, but had also inflicted years of additional suffering on his family by maintaining the deception that he had simply disappeared. The conclusion of the trial brought a measure of closure to a case that had haunted the Tucson community for 16 years, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase of grief and healing for the Turner family. Michael's remains were finally laid to rest in a proper burial service that was attended by hundreds of community members who had never given up hope that the truth would eventually emerge. The aftermath of Emma Turner's conviction rippled through the Tucson community like shockwaves from a distant earthquake, forcing residents to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for deception that can exist even in the closest relationships. The case that had begun with a missing person report in 1995 had evolved into a complex story of murder, manipulation, and the devastating consequences of secrets kept for too long. As the legal proceedings concluded, and Emma began serving her life sentence, the community was left to process the full implications of what had transpired in their midst. Sarah Turner faced the monumental task of rebuilding her understanding of her own life and family history. Everything she had believed about her childhood, her parents' marriage, and her mother's character had been revealed to be built on a foundation of lies and deception. The young woman who had once been defined by her role as the daughter of a missing person now had to navigate the world as the daughter of both a murder victim and a convicted killer. The psychological impact of this revelation was profound and lasting, requiring years of therapy and support to process. In the months following the trial, Sarah made the difficult decision to change her name and relocate to another state, seeking to escape the notoriety that surrounded her family's story. She continued her work as a counselor, finding that her own experience with trauma and loss gave her unique insight into the struggles of the young people she worked with. While she rarely spoke publicly about her family's case, those who knew her described someone who had found a way to transform unimaginable pain into a source of strength and compassion for others. Dorothy Turner's declining health accelerated rapidly after the trial, as if the stress of learning the truth about her son's death had finally broken something fundamental in her spirit. The elderly woman who had spent 15 years defending her daughter-in-law against community suspicions now faced the devastating reality that her instincts had been completely wrong. She passed away just 8 months after Emma's conviction, and those who attended her funeral spoke of a woman who had never fully recovered from the betrayal of discovering that she had been protecting her son's killer. The impact on the broader Turner family was equally devastating. Michael's siblings, who had maintained relationships with Emma throughout the years following his disappearance, struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the calculating killer who had been revealed during the trial. Family gatherings became strained and eventually ceased altogether, as relatives found it too difficult to process their conflicting emotions about Emma and their guilt over having failed to recognize her true nature. The community's response to the case was complex and multifaceted, reflecting the various ways that different residents had been affected by the 16-year mystery. Some people felt vindicated in their long-held suspicions about Emma's involvement in Michael's disappearance, while others were shocked by the confirmation that someone they had known and trusted was capable of such calculated violence. The case forced everyone to confront uncomfortable questions about how well they really knew their neighbors and what signs they might have missed. Local law enforcement used the Turner case as a learning experience, examining what had gone wrong with the original investigation and implementing new procedures to prevent similar oversights in the future. Detective Chen became something of a celebrity within law enforcement circles, speaking at conferences about the importance of persistence in cold case investigations and the value of modern forensic techniques in solving older crimes. The case became a textbook example of how advances in technology and investigative methods could breathe new life into cases that had seemed hopeless. The Turner case also had broader implications for how missing person investigations are conducted. The assumption that Michael had simply chosen to disappear had led to a less thorough initial investigation, and this mistake had allowed Emma to escape detection for 15 years. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reviewing their procedures for handling missing person cases, recognizing that the presumption of voluntary disappearance could sometimes mask more sinister explanations. The psychological aspects of the case fascinated mental health professionals, who studied Emma's ability to maintain a normal facade for 15 years while hiding such a significant secret. Her capacity for compartmentalization and emotional detachment became the subject of academic papers and conference presentations, contributing to the understanding of how certain personality types can commit serious crimes while continuing to function normally in society. The media coverage of the case continued long after the trial concluded, with true crime documentaries, podcasts, and books examining various aspects of the story. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions about people based on their public personas, and it highlighted the importance of thorough investigation, even in cases where the obvious explanation seems to be the correct one. Emma Turner herself adapted to prison life with the same emotional detachment that had characterized her behavior throughout the investigation and trial. Fellow inmates and prison staff described her as quiet and cooperative, someone who kept to herself and showed little emotion about her circumstances. She refused most interview requests from journalists and researchers, maintaining her silence about the details of Michael's murder and her motivations for the crime. The location where Michael's car had been found became something of a pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts and those interested in the case. The remote desert area, once known only to geologists and occasional hikers, was now marked in the public consciousness as the place where a 15-year mystery had finally been solved. Local authorities eventually erected a small memorial marker at the site, not to commemorate the crime, but to honor Michael's memory and acknowledge the perseverance of those who had never given up hope that the truth would emerge. The Turner case also had practical implications for forensic science, demonstrating the value of preserving evidence even in cases where immediate analysis might not yield results. The fact that usable DNA and toxicology evidence had survived 15 years in the desert environment provided valuable insights for forensic specialists working on other cold cases. The techniques developed during the examination of Michael's remains were later applied to other investigations, helping to solve additional cases that had seemed hopeless. As years passed, the Turner case became part of the local folklore, a story that was passed down through the community as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still prevail. The case changed how people in the community viewed their neighbors and themselves, creating a heightened awareness of the potential for darkness that could exist beneath seemingly ordinary facades. The desert itself became a character in the story, a vast and unforgiving landscape that had both concealed and eventually revealed the truth about Michael Turner's fate. The harsh beauty of the Arizona wilderness, with its towering saguaro cacti and endless horizons, served as a reminder that some secrets are too heavy to remain buried forever. The natural forces of erosion and time that had gradually exposed Michael's car also symbolized the inexorable march of justice, slow but persistent. For the investigators who had worked on the case, the Turner investigation became a defining moment in their careers. Detective Chen received commendations for her thoroughness and persistence, but she also carried the weight of knowing that earlier action might have brought justice sooner. The case taught her and her colleagues that cold cases are never truly cold. They are simply waiting for the right combination of technology, persistence, and circumstance to bring them back to life. The legal precedents established during Ima's trial had implications for other cases involving long-concealed crimes. The successful prosecution, despite the passage of 15 years, demonstrated that time alone cannot wash away the consequences of murder, and that advances in forensic science can breathe new life into seemingly hopeless cases. Prosecutors across the country began re-examining their own cold case files, looking for situations where new techniques might yield fresh evidence. The story of Michael and Ima Turner became a cautionary tale about the danger of making assumptions about people based on their public behavior. Ima had been seen as a devoted wife and mother, someone who had suffered a terrible loss and deserved the community's sympathy and support. The revelation that this perception had been carefully constructed to conceal a calculated murder forced everyone who had known the family to question their own judgment and their ability to recognize deception. Sarah Turner's journey toward healing and reconciliation with her past became an inspiration for others who had experienced similar betrayals of trust. Her decision to use her experience as a source of strength in her work with troubled youth demonstrated that even the most devastating experiences can be transformed into sources of compassion and understanding. She rarely spoke about her family's case, but when she did, it was always with an emphasis on the importance of truth and the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest circumstances. The case also highlighted the importance of community support systems and the need for better resources for families dealing with missing person cases. The Turner family's 15-year ordeal demonstrated how the uncertainty surrounding a disappearance can be almost as devastating as confirmed death, creating a kind of ambiguous loss that is difficult to process and overcome. Support groups for families of missing persons use the Turner case as an example of both the hope for resolution and the potential for unexpected and painful discoveries. Michael Turner's memory was preserved not just in the official records of his murder case, but in the lives of the students he had taught, the Little League players he had coached, and the co-workers who had respected his dedication and integrity. Those who had known him described a man who had been looking forward to his future, someone who had been making plans and nurturing dreams that were cut short by an act of betrayal from the person he should have been able to trust most. The anniversary of Michael's disappearance continued to be marked by the community, but now it served a different purpose. Instead of being a day of uncertainty and speculation, it became a day of remembrance for a man whose life had been stolen from him and whose family had been forced to endure years of deception and manipulation. The community's annual memorial service grew over the years, becoming a broader acknowledgement of all the victims of unsolved crimes and their families who continue to seek answers. Ima Turner's life sentence ensured that she would spend the remainder of her days paying for her crime, but questions about her motivations and the full extent of her planning remained unanswered. Her refusal to provide a complete confession or explanation meant that some aspects of the case would forever remain mysteries. This silence was perhaps the final act of manipulation, denying closure to those who had been most deeply affected by her actions. The desert where Michael's car had been found continued to yield other secrets over the years, as improved search techniques and persistent investigators uncovered additional evidence from other cases. The harsh landscape that had concealed so many secrets began to give them up, one by one, as technology and determination combined to bring long-overdue justice to other victims and their families. As the years passed, and the immediate drama of the Turner case faded from daily conversation, it left behind important lessons about the nature of justice, the power of persistence, and the capacity of communities to support each other through even the most difficult revelations. The case became part of the collective memory of Tucson, a reminder that truth has its own timeline, and that those who seek it must be prepared for whatever they might find. The story of Michael Turner ended not with his disappearance in 1995, but with his proper burial in 2011. Surrounded by family and friends who had never given up hope that he would one day come home. His grave marker bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of his life. Beloved Father, Son, and Teacher, the truth will set you free. Subscribe to our channel to explore more disturbing cold cases. Thank you for following the story of Michael Turner. See you in the next video.